This is the Widow Podcast, and I am Karen Sutton, the Widow Coach. I'll be supporting you through the loss of your life partner so you can find a more positive way through your grief. I want to give you hope after loss and to know that when you are ready, you can create a meaningful life for yourself with the help of me, Karen Sutton, and the Widow Podcast. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Widow Podcast. This week we are having a very important conversation and I have got a very lovely guest joining me. I've got Victoria Tolchard. Have I said that right, Victoria Tolchard? Yep. Yes, good. To make sure you get these things right. Who is a qualified art therapist. Victoria will tell us a little bit more about what she does in a moment. Today, we wanted to open up the conversation about death and dying because it is so important and it's something that is incredibly difficult and scary for us to face and think about in terms of our loved ones and ourselves. And it's giving you the opening, I suppose, to think about maybe these conversations. I get approached by people who are nursing, caring for spouses, life partners, even parents sometimes, and wanting to understand more about their choices, what's available to them, what to expect when their person dies, before their person dies, and after their person dies, because you can feel very alone in that world. And I think there's a lot of guilt as well around looking for the support that you could maybe get after your person has gone because they haven't gone yet. And there's definitely a gap. And I'm hoping that this conversation helps in some small way to bridge that gap. I know there's a lot more needed, and I know this is a huge passion of Victoria's. I'm hoping that actually this will help you with whatever you're going through right now and allow you to have those very difficult, scary conversations with, whoever you need to be having them with. So Victoria, hello. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. It's lovely to have you here.
Oh, it's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So do you want to start just by telling us a little bit about you, what you do?
So I am a qualified art therapist, but I have happened to end up working for quite some time in children's hospice. And then more recently, in the last 5 years, I worked for a cancer support charity. That's taken me to supporting people throughout the whole of this journey, from a kind of diagnosis. Yes, it is cancer, but we could think about in this conversation about any kind of incurable disease, if you like. Obviously, some people go on to be cured, and that's great, but there are obviously a number of families that don't have that diagnosis. And so I kind of support them throughout that whole journey, and it's a real privilege to do that through end of life and into bereavement. My experience is that there is a big gap in the conversations in that period of time between the terminal or incurable diagnosis and into dying. And there's a huge amount of support for bereavement, but not maybe particularly in this kind of little section. And it's not that there's right or wrongs, but I think it's just this huge fear of even opening up those conversations. So I hope today that we can kind of start to do that.
Absolutely. It's difficult, isn't it? In those situations, facing the reality and then talking about it in a very honest way, because it's so emotive. It's so emotive, and it brings so much fear up inside of us, doesn't it? That, we're not very good at that, are we? We want to avoid it. We want to push it away, anything to avoid going to a very uncomfortable place. But actually that fear I believe, and by talking to people that have lived with that fear and allowed it to keep them prisoner in this place, almost have a lot of regrets about that, and really start to see after their person has died how it would have benefited everyone if that fear hadn't have held them in that place. So why do we have these conversations, Victoria? Why is it so important to have them in the first place?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's huge, and we do fear that. And I just want to touch on something. We do hold that in our body, so it's not just kind of a thought process either. It's very physical. The fear. So it's about how to kind of get beyond that and start those conversations. But I think it's really, really important for the person that's dying to have those conversations, because sometimes if we allow the unspoken just to kind of sit around, it might be uncomfortable for them. But I think if we can start to listen to what the person that's dying actually is really thinking and feeling, we're able to support them. And ultimately that means that they will kind of, hopefully people will start to see that as we move through this conversation, that they can actually have a really good death. There's obviously caveats to that, and that's really hard when somebody maybe doesn't, but I think if we can start to have those conversations, then better deaths can be had. And it is really scary to think about that, but and people might think, oh, that's a little bit powerful, but I think some deaths can be actually really positive and very amazing experiences. Much like we are born into this world, we prepare for that and we take time and we think about that. We need to start thinking more about how we end our life. I think as a society, we've started to kind of, it's behind closed doors a little bit too much. And the process is taken away by undertakers. And I know that it's changing slightly, but there still is this huge fear about talking about it. And then I think for the people that will be left to grieve, it's huge, because they will have been able to have those conversations instead of having to sit with the what ifs. Oh, we don't know what he or she wanted. Oh, they're not, they're not here to ask those questions. There's a lot of guesswork. And I think you probably see this, like a lot of guilt in knowing what the right thing to do is after. If we prepare and we're prepared to have the conversations, then a lot of this stuff can be done quite early on. And then another kind of big thing that I'm quite passionate about is actually being able to live in those moments that you have left, which is hugely important for everybody.
I think that's so important, isn't it? Because I remember one lady in my membership was saying that actually they threw a big party. They got all their friends around. I can't remember how long it was before her partner died, but the palliative care nurses turned up the next day and the house was carnage. There was just like bottles of booze everywhere. But it felt so good to be able to live in the face of dying, and to be able to say to everyone, come around, let's have some fun, let's create. I mean, I'm not suggesting everyone has to throw a party, but to your point, doing what feels right for you, and understanding that yes, there is a huge dark cloud weighing over you. There is, you can't deny that, but being able to create something that can feel good in those moments is just such a wonderful thing to do.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of these conversations hinder people from doing that because there's so much unspoken and unknown.
Yeah.
I think people also fear what they're going to experience and see if you're watching someone die, or equally the person's unsure of what it's going to be like to die.
Yeah.
But I think that it's really important to remember that until very close to that point of end of life, we're still living and we can actually do some things. I mean, if we look at the Queen, she was very capable right up until the end, and I think that some people forget that. They're a little bit too focused on the dying and these people, that your loved one is going to die, well, actually, it up until a point, they're actually still living, and they have choices, and you can, if it's physically possible, do lots of really lovely things in and around that time.
It's very hard though, isn't it, to have these conversations when you don't know how to approach them, when you feel like your person maybe doesn't want to accept the fact that they've died. You're maybe living in a place of denial. You're both wanting to kind of pretend it's okay, and we're going to find a way through this, and maybe we can solve it with like homeopathic medicines or changing our diets, and there's almost that element of, let's not face the unthinkable because it's too much. So let's and that does, you do hear stories where that works, don't you, where people have said, we didn't ever think of it, and we just went out and we discovered everything we could to help us, and my person survived. It's a miracle. and it does, but for the most part, these things don't happen. So how do we go about approaching these conversations when they feel like every part of our body is going, don't do it, I don't know if it's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think it's just important just to go back on what you said. Hope is really amazing. It drives us to do lots of wonderful things, and it really does help in situations like this. But I also think that it is really important to be I guess realistic in the moment, but how do you have those conversations? Really important. How do you have any conversation? Okay, you surround yourself with your family and your friends and your loved ones, and you connect. I think it might be really interesting for people to ask, like, how have we had hard conversations before in the past? What have we done? Because that's your strengths, and that they've worked in the past, so you can kind of try and utilize those things. I love this thing that I heard on a course was, what would love do in this situation? And love would absolutely have the conversations. Love would surround yourself in a safe, familiar space with the people that you feel comfortable with. Love might seek support, because that's what you do when you love somebody and you want this to be right. So I think those things are really important. I do a lot of work with children. I think it's really important to include children. I kind of want to get that in there because they are a huge part of family. And children can teach us lots of things. They're very good at the kind of, this is how it is. They don't want to know the fluffy stuff. They want to know the details in obviously their language, but that helps them. And I think we need to take strength from that, because actually, if we do have these honest conversations, it's going to help us in the end too.
And I think I honestly, we can learn so much from children, because they don't layer stuff up, do they? They're raw, they're real, they're simple in how they think and how they feel. It kind of, they want to know the truth. And I think that's the same for us as adults, isn't it, really? As scary as it is, we do want to know what's going on. We do want to understand what we're going to be faced with. I mean, we are built for survival, aren't we? We are designed to find a way to survive in whatever situation we find ourselves in. So naturally, we are going to do that, whatever that looks like for you. And I think sometimes that can look like, if you are losing a life partner, you want to know what you've got coming on the other side of that. You want to know that you're going to be okay. But that can feel selfish, because how can you be thinking about, oh, well, am I going to be okay in all this when my person's going to be dying? But we are wired for survival. We do want to know the facts of things, and we do want to understand things to the best of our ability. And I think sometimes remembering how we are with children can help us think about how we can be with each other as adults as well, because that's still in us, isn't it?
And I think the language is really important as well. So I think a lot of these conversations are not necessarily about giving definite answers or information. It's just creating spaces to have thoughts and ideas. And it's a bit like, well, what about? Oh, I was thinking this, but what were you thinking? And can our thoughts kind of come out into a space where we can kind of make some decisions? We kind of do that with children, don't we? We don't. I mean, there are times where we tell children what to do, but really, what we're trying to do is nurture them, and I think that's really the same for adults. And so, how we need the right spaces, but we need the right language, and we need to be open to receiving and kind of giving thoughts and kind of feelings as well, so that we can start to think about the importance of the end, and what that kind of looks like, what that's going to be like.
And I think as well, being open to listening and really hearing, because especially when you're so close to the person, you've got your own ideals, haven't you, and needs, which is absolutely okay, but sometimes they can cloud your judgment, and sometimes it can affect what you're hearing from your person, what they're saying for you, if you're able to have these conversations. And it is really opening your heart, isn't it? And listening to what they're saying, really hearing that, and not maybe you sort of asking the question and not listening, and just wanting to respond and say, oh, it's okay, we're going to sort it, just holding that space for someone in that moment, I think is such a gift to give someone.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think something else that I have been told, and I always keep it in mind, is when we're at the end of life through being elderly or an incurable disease, actually death doesn't have to be medical. And really we need to take it back to it being about society and social. Historically, we didn't end up in hospital with lots of drugs. We were at home, surrounded by our communities, with people visiting, people bringing meals, people telling stories, and being by the bedside. And I think that's been taken away from us slightly. And so now it's a bit scary for people to have those conversations, because it's done for them. And actually we didn't used to allow that to happen. We did it ourselves.
And it's changed so much, hasn't it? I think it has become very medicalized, and sometimes, sometimes it has to be, because there's a lot of support that needs to be put in place. But I think we have lost the ability to create meaningful deaths. And I do feel it's changing. I feel like there's a lot of movement out there to help people in this space. It's starting to be recognized, actually, that maybe we have medicalized it too much, and we've taken away people's choices too much, and we've hidden it from people, and it's not deemed a natural part of life. Exactly. It goes back to me being a midwife, but when somebody comes in and they find out they're pregnant, the planning that goes into the pregnancy, the changes you make, and then the event itself, the giving birth, and then preparing yourself for afterwards, for the changes that are going to come, and the new life, and I think that's such a wonderful way of thinking about death as well. That planning for the death, that really thinking about how you can make it as meaningful as you can. I always remember David Kessler saying, the more meaningful the death, the more meaningful the grief. And I see it so much, and it's allowing yourself to create that in that space, so that you can have a more meaningful grief afterwards. Not that it when I say meaningful, I don't mean that it's not painful or awful, because grief is, But I think when you've had those conversations, when you know you have given your person what they wanted, what they needed, what felt right for them, that's a beautiful thing, I think. And death can be a beautiful thing.
It can absolutely be beautiful and amazing. And there are amazing professions that are doing this work. But I do think that, and like you say, it is changing, but I do think it is still quite behind closed doors. You know, it's within the hospices. And why isn't it talked about just in general more, like we do, but like giving birth? You know, it's such an amazing thing that it just needs to be a bit more of a easier conversation for people, I think. And the outcomes are so much better for everybody involved if you're able to do some of the work beforehand.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because it's the only certainty we have in life. We're going to die. We're all going to die. There's no getting away from it. And we have been dying forever. This isn't new to us. and you know, not to make light of it, but you'd think, wouldn't you, with all that history and the fact that it's going to happen to all of us, why is it so behind closed doors? Why is it so unimaginable to us? And I get it, because we don't know what that process looks like, feels like. We don't know what's on the other side of it. We worry about our loved ones, don't we, when we leave them, and all of that stuff is
but
deeply concerning.
we need to be more prepared, don't we, as a, you know, society, I guess, in terms of that. And that there's no right or wrong. There's not any, you know, like, you can't fix it, but actually if we can just start to have the conversations, I think that's just like a really great, you know, point, you know, and it not be, or not for people to not shy away from that, to almost be a little bit interested in that. I know it provokes fear immediately, of course it does, but the reason it does that is, I think, because we just don't have the conversations about it.
We're not used to it. And actually, I think we live in a world where we find solutions for everything. We can fix anything because we have got everything at our fingertips. But when somebody's dying, you can't fix that. And then that feels out of your control. We don't like to feel out of control, do we? We like to feel that we have an element of control over everything. But actually, as much as you can't maybe stop your person from dying, look at what you can control in that situation, and look at what you can do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Instead of thinking about what you can't do, because there's a lot, isn't there? We have so many choices. And I think from talking to you before about this, Victoria, you know, I'm aware of some of the choices, but even some of them I wasn't aware of. I was quite surprised, actually, that, you know, we don't have to have our person's body collected within an hour of them dying. You know, like, we can keep them if we want to keep them. It's really understanding these things, isn't it? Like, but we're not aware of them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's so much choice that I think people are really, really unaware of. It might be good, just if we touched on, there's some kind of practical stuff, you know, that needs doing. You know, making sure that you have a will, and making sure that that's done right. You can take time to make sure that your passwords and your bank accounts and all of those kind of practical stuff is done, and it's in a safe place, and someone knows where to kind of find all of that information. We can have power of attorneys for all our financial stuff, but we can also write out power of attorneys for our well-being. And we can go into more detail about what that could include in a bit. But we can also, if we, especially I think if we have an incurable disease or elderly end of life, we can make an advanced care plan. And you can do that with your GP, your palliative care team, the nurses that are around you. And I think that's really, really important. That's kind of going back to that medicalization of a death. If you know that you're dying, you don't want to be resuscitated, and you have a choice to write that down. You also get a choice in what pain relief you might want. And we did talk about this earlier on when we were chatting. I think especially if you have dementia, or before that, you can have all these choices in place, but when that gets to that point, you don't you can't advocate for yourself. So it's really important to have somebody to be advocating for you, and that's written down, and all the things that you kind of want in terms of that. And then there's a huge piece of work, I think, in terms of having conversations about the little things. Where do you want to be when you die? You do have choices, and it's important to hear, I think, from the person that's dying, but also the people that are around them as well. Do they want to be at home, or actually is it better for them as a family to be in a hospice? And there's choices around that, and there's choices around what you want that place to look like. And that goes, all the way down to small details like what candles you want to have in the room. Do you have favorite flowers that you'd like to have around? Some people might find that they really want to be outside in those last moments. All these things are possible, we just don't talk about them. I think it's important to say that these things might change, and of course they will do over time, because you might think about it at some point and you might change your mind as you go along, but that's fine as long as you're having the conversations about it. And also, there are things that get in the way, practical things, and you might end up with your loved one in hospital, and that's not your choice, but you still can create an environment in the room that you happen to be in that still includes all of those small things. It includes the people that person wants to be there. It could be the bedding that they have on the bed. And I think that's the bit that people kind of really don't know, that there are a lot of choice around.
And it's so important, isn't it? Because when I think about myself and my death, and I do, I do, these are things you weigh up, aren't they? Because you naturally, sometimes you want to die at home in your own bed because it's comfortable. You've got your pillows, the bedding that you like, and you're familiar with the smells and the sounds. And those things I think are really important as we die, because our senses, especially smell for us, I think that becomes almost quite heightened, doesn't it, in the days before or what have you. But then you have that thought of, well, I don't want that to be traumatic for my family. I don't want that to be the overriding memory, because some people, I've spoken to clients where their person wanted to die at home, but actually they found that really difficult, because then they've got that memory in their home. And it's very hard to have these honest conversations and think about these things, because two people will be coming from different angles. But you're right, there's so many tiny little details in that, what we want to be wearing, what we want around us, who we want around us. I think, because for me, I feel like I would just love to be hearing people laughing and talking and having fun. That would give me great. I love it. I just love it. I've always loved it. I love being around people. I love hearing people enjoying each other and having fun, but there's an element of us, isn't there, that thinks we can't do that when somebody's dying. That's really disrespectful. It's got to be quiet and somber and respectful. But death doesn't look how you think it. I mean, it's portrayed in a certain way, isn't it, on TV and in movies, and it's always a similar thing, but it just really doesn't portray real life. And I think that sometimes we get ingrained in that's how it should be, that's how it has to be. But understanding you have so much say in these things, but we're too scared to ask. We're too scared to ask for these things to become our reality in those moments, because there's so much else going on, isn't there? It's often quite a chaotic time.
There is, but I think because we've not asked, or we see stuff on television, or we have a perception of what it's going to look like, but it can be however the family want it to be.
Mm.
I'm similar to you. I'd like to be surrounded by people really just having a good time and enjoying the space, really.
Yeah.
That was very much like it was for us as a family when my mum died.
Mm.
She was at home. That's where she wanted to be, and it was surrounded by family and friends coming round, and we'd be round the table. There'd be like 10 people every night, and towards the end she was obviously upstairs, but there was still a lot of laughter and drinking wine and
Yeah.
reminiscing, sometimes with her there and other times not. And it was, and we I can genuinely look back and say it was amazing, and it was full of love. That word again, what would love do in this moment? Well, love would surround the person with all of the things that they love and that they enjoy doing in life. Why wouldn't
Yeah.
you see somebody out in the same way?
It's weird, isn't it, you saying that the love word again? It's almost like we have difficulty in saying love, and thinking about love and telling people we love them, and thinking about self-love. It's sometimes it's as uncomfortable for people as talking about death and dying, isn't it? There's that that typical British stiff upper lip. And understanding, I think, that talking to somebody about death and dying comes from a place of love every time.
Absolutely.
Every
And
time.
I think maybe that's something that might be really worth people remembering when they're being offered that, the support. um it's tricky. I find every conversation I have with a family, it's a little tricky,
Yeah.
because you never know what their reaction is going to be. But it always comes from a place of love and wanting to support them, and kind of giving them all the options that they have. And like, we've used the word a lot, choices, but all of the things that you can do in
Mm.
these moments that make this
Mm.
as good a death as it can be.
And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? That we all find this conversation tricky. It's difficult to have. You work in this space, I work in this space, I know many people that work in this space, but there are still moments in time where you don't know what to say. You're worried you're going to upset someone, or say something that's going to come across in the wrong way, because we all have a different way of dealing with this. We all hear things in different ways, and what's comforting to one is maybe not so comforting to someone else, and might be quite triggering. But actually, if you can be brave enough to say something anyway, and say, maybe own that and say, look, I'm sorry if anything I say ever upsets you or doesn't feel very kind, then that's never my intention. I'm here for you, and I want to be able to have these conversations, because I speak to a lot of my clients who say that they lose that intimacy with their person, that husband wife partnership, two people living together, whether you're married or not. When you become someone's caregiver, there's a huge shift in that, isn't there? And I've heard people say that they wish they'd done more to help protect the relationship that they had, so they could continue with that intimacy. And that intimacy can look like a lot of different ways. And we spoke earlier, didn't we? And actually, sometimes you may still want to have sex, and you can still have sex, but it's so much more than that. And one of my other clients said that one of the most intimate moments she had with her husband was one night when they were lying on the bed. She got a pen and paper, and they just had all of these conversations, and they opened their hearts, and they talked about the death and what would happen and what was wanted. And she said she'd never felt closer to him in her life, and it was such an intimate, magical moment. And I think these conversations can really help us protect that part of our relationship, as much as they're difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that carer role is really important to, you might not necessarily want to have that conversation with the person that's dying. You might have that I think it's important to have it with the person that's dying, but it might feel initially quite hard. So you might want to have that conversation away to explore what that means for you. What does it mean to caring for your loved one? And is there a line? Is there a place where actually, no, that's too much and you need to get some professional help in to do probably a lot of the physical stuff, actually, because that's when maybe the intimacy is kind of is lost a little bit. And interesting, isn't it, just going back to choices, we can get into bed with the person that's dying. Why not? I think a lot of people think that they can't. Why not get under the covers with them and sleep with them, be with them, not just the partner, but children and other people, family and friends. Not that they want to get into bed with them, but just be with them and hold them and hug them. And I think there's sense of, oh, we can't do that anymore. But of course you can. And it goes right back. I know I keep saying it, but that's what love would do. Love would be right beside that person, having conversations. If you get married and you have children, you're always having those conversations out of love for the people, making good decisions and choices for them in the as we move through life. Why do we stop doing that at the end? Like, why do we put up this barrier and kind of all of a sudden, oh, we don't have those conversations anymore? It's crazy to think that, isn't it? And they're so important. Be yeah For it to be intimate, for it to be still, it's the connection, isn't it? Still having the time. And I think, going back, my biggest message is there's no right or wrong, and everyone is going to do it differently. You mentioned that before. Everyone comes from a different culture. People have different religions and beliefs. Some people will have a very strong religious value, but other people won't, but they will believe in something. And other cultures, I mean, we can look to cultures and gain some really good insight, because some of them do it really well, in terms of how well they are at being with people around death and dying, and what they do. It's so important to do that. Sorry, I lost my chain of thought a little bit there. I was going off on a tangent, but that's what I was going to say. It's just important to create the space, to be available for the conversations, to, like you say, open up your heart to the possibility of an opportunity to have a conversation. Not that you would get it right or wrong, and not that there's anything to fix, and not that you're going to come up with all the answers that you need, but just being open to start.
And I think that it's a wonderful skill to have in life, actually, and one that I think we need in grief when our person has died. And it really is that understanding that we don't always have the answers. There's some things in life that just can't be fixed. But when somebody can hold space for you and let you speak your truth and listen and say, I don't have the answers, I don't have a solution, but I will walk beside you whilst you try and figure this out, and I will do what I can. Like, that's so powerful. And I think instead of searching for things to say and do that can feel helpful, it is sometimes just sitting next to someone, isn't it? And like you say, providing that container for them to be able to share whatever it is they want to share. Because we're also, we all want to protect each other, don't we? Nobody wants to upset anyone or hurt anyone, and we don't want to cause people more pain. But what I see over and over again is that, when we share those vulnerabilities and those fears, they are deeply connecting. And I've had ladies say to me that they never cried, they never said they were upset, they never said they were scared, and they wish actually they'd shared that with that person, because they wish they'd known how much they loved them and how hard this was for them. Not to add any suffering, but just to think, you know, that they weren't thinking, oh, she's doing all right. Why isn't she upset? It's more about the housework.
That's a great start. What is it that you're afraid of?
Mm.
Why, what is it that's stopping you from having these conversations? And then just being curious. Oh, how about, have you thought about that? Oh, I was thinking about, and looking and kind of exploring the possibilities.
It's a really good point, actually, because how do we bring these things up? Like, where do we create these openings? How do we know if it's the right time for somebody? Because when we might feel ready, they might not feel ready. And I think that's a really lovely isn't it, of just testing the waters, of not going in too deep. But had you thought of this? And you'll know, won't you, from a reaction, whether it's a conversation that's going to go anywhere in that moment or not. But just because it doesn't in that moment, don't not go back to it, I think.
Absolutely, because hopefully you've planted a seed. You've planted a seed of, oh, there is a possibility that I could have a conversation around this. Another thing that I was just thinking about, came up to mind when you were saying something then, was also I think that there's probably a lot of people that will resonate if I say, oh, I wish I had said that, or I didn't get an opportunity to do that. And I think that's really important for both the person that's dying and the and family and friends, that if there's something that's unresolved, having an opportunity to say that, or just being able to have opportunities to say anything really that you think, gosh, I want to say that, because if I don't say that, I'm going to think about that forever, and I'm not going to have the opportunity to do that. And that might be to thank people. It could be all kinds of different things, but I think that's really important part of these conversations as well.
It is, and I've spoken to so many people that said, oh, I didn't say it because I didn't know that they were going to die that quickly. And we don't know, and people say, oh, that the hospice didn't tell me that he would deteriorate that quickly, or that she was going to suddenly change her condition and die. But that's the point, isn't it? As much as you know it's going to happen, you don't know when. So if there is something that you want to say, you want to discuss, you want to just maybe gain some closure on, do it. Just do it when you get an opportunity. Create the opportunity, because things can suddenly change, can't they? Quite quickly. Somebody can be relatively okay one day, and maybe they've gone out for a walk, and you've had quite a nice day together, and then the next they're unconscious, and the opportunity to have any kind of conversation has gone. And I think that can really take people by surprise, can't it? That change in their person.
And also I think that people can change their minds about things as well. So and that's another thing, I think, to advocate for the person that's dying, not to assume stuff. My my mum was quite religious, and there'd been some, not a falling out, but there'd been a bit of a disagreement, I think, in terms of how she felt that the church was supporting her. And I remember the vicar arriving at the door, and I told him to go away, and my mum went, no, go back and get him. And I was like running down the street saying, no, she wants to see you. And that would have been hugely important for her, because that actually would have been an opportunity for her to, I don't know what the conversation was, but she was able to do. I nearly didn't allow that to happen. So, it's really important that this tuning in to everybody. It's not just about the people that are having to witness it. It's about the person that's dying too.
Yeah, absolutely, and they are at the heart of all of this, aren't they? And it's remembering what they want. And I think that's a very valid point, not assuming. When the ladies in my membership was protecting her husband, they didn't want to talk about the fact he was going to die. She didn't want anyone to tell him he was going to die, because she thought he didn't want to know. And very cleverly, I think the palliative care nurse got involved, and very gently brought up the conversation. And she said it was the best thing. It was the best thing because then he was able to express his wishes. They were able to have the conversations. They brought him home to die. And she said that would have been very difficult to live with had she not have had that conversation and was left wondering what if, which I know a lot of people are. And I know a lot of people carry a huge burden when they reflect back and think of the things they didn't say, the conversations they didn't have, the things they didn't write down. So many people have said, they wish they'd written more notes or got their person to write letters or dictate letters and what have you. But
that's difficult in the moment, isn't it? Because you are in this thing that kind of organically has a life of its own. But I think it's about maybe taking away from that maybe going forward in their future that they would take the opportunity, because then there's abilities, and that's not to feel guilty or around. It's just that we learn from everything, don't we? So that's our learned experience of that. So hopefully they'll take that forward and know that in the future that when the opportunity arises, when somebody maybe suggests something or opens up a space, that now they will actually grab it and kind of run with it.
I think that's so true. It's really remembering that you can learn from these things and you can take those learnings forward and actually focus on the things that you did do, because we've all in those moments done a lot for our person and cared for them in the best way that we knew how, and it's focusing on that and remembering those things, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so important. Do you know what, Victoria? There's so much for us to discuss here. Right? There is so much more I wanted to talk about. What death looks like, what happens after the person has died. How we can help ourselves have a more meaningful grief and a more peaceful grief. Maybe we should do a part 2 and follow up, because it's such a big topic, isn't it? It's such a big topic. And, I really want people to get the most out of your knowledge and experience in this, and anything that I can offer as well. Obviously, Simon didn't die from an illness. He died very suddenly. So I haven't experienced that in a life partner. But I have had family members, and obviously with my nursing background, I know what death and dying looks like, and how that is, from a carer's point of view. And it's tough. It's really tough. And
but it's also maybe not what people expect. Again, back watching it on TV, whatever. You're right. There's a lot of information almost in that one thing, in what does that look like. And I think that, again, if we're prepared and we've had conversations around that, we the experience of that is much is better for everybody. And that is a huge topic. It's also really hard to talk about, but I wonder, it would be interesting to hear what people would want us to chat about, if part 2 in particular. It'd be nice to actually answer some questions maybe, or
absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Just see what would be helpful to people. I've heard a lot of people saying that they wish they'd known what death looked like and sounded like, because it's not always as quiet and peaceful as one would imagine, and it can feel traumatic from the outside looking in, but that's not necessarily the experience the person dying is having. And it, like you say, when you understand that and what the body does when it dies, it does create a calmer environment, doesn't it, in that time and space, which is important.
It's really important. And I think that's one thing that I wish I'd known when I was watching my mum. And we were surrounded by, I've said, love and family, and it made that and we were very present, so it made it okay. But there were definitely things that I guess witnessed over the last kind of week that I wasn't prepared for. But actually now I know that they're really normal. They're definitely a part of, the natural way of dying and letting go. And it is really interesting. I think there is a lot of feedback from people that say, it was so traumatic for my loved one. I think they were in a lot of pain, and they were, uncomfortable, and they seemed to struggle, which may well be the case. Of course, we can't, dismiss that. But I do think that there is a lot of the natural way looks like that. It looks distressing, but actually for the person it isn't. It's quite involuntary reactions of the body. And I also think, and maybe we could end on this, is if we have all of these lovely conversations and we have the opportunity to create space to discuss what the person wants to have at the end of life, maybe it wouldn't be seen as being so traumatic, because you would have had the time and the space to prepare and to make it right for that person and the people that are around them.
Yeah. And that's what makes it meaningful, doesn't it? That's what can create a beautiful death. And I know it sounds weird for people to hear us talk about meaningful, beautiful, amazing, wonderful deaths, but it's important, isn't it? I'd like to think that I could have that for myself, and I could give that to those around me if the situation allows it. And there's many things we can do, I think, to allow that in.
It's possible. It's possible. We start to open up the conversation.
Thank you so much for your time and for sharing everything you have shared with us. It's been I love it. I love talking about these things. I think it's so needed. There's such a gap, and people feel so alone out there in what they're going through. And I don't want that. I know you don't want that. I know you're incredibly passionate about this. So we will be back. We will return, and there will be a part 2 to this. We will keep going with the conversation. But thank you so much, Victoria. It's been so lovely.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for listening to the Widow podcast with me, Karen Sutton. If you would like to be part of a supportive community of people who understand your grief, come and join my free Facebook group, Widowed and Rising. And make sure you tune in to the next episode of the Widow podcast.